Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here in Florida. Actually, it's great to be out of Washington for obvious reasons, not just because it's such a tough time to be there, but because this conference is touching on topics that are of such great interest to the United States, to the future of the wireless industry, and of course, the future of the entire economy. It's something that we want to be upbeat. I'm coming from DC. I want to be upbeat. There's a lot of promise here with IoT, and it's not just about great connectivity for computers and for tablets and for handheld devices, but for industrial infrastructure, transportation, healthcare, and on and on. So I'll try to stay upbeat, but like I said, coming from Washington, it's kind of hard to do that. I'm here to talk about issues that, since I'm from DC, keep people up at night. And one of them today is the big challenge facing IoT infrastructure, the idea of connectivity. My group, the Wireless Infrastructure Association, focuses every day on how to promote the massive expansion of infrastructure in order to make all the things that you're talking about possible, to really ensure that the connectivity demands are met for seamless connectivity. And that means mobile, too, obviously. People talk about mobile. Are any cloud companies here? I'm sure there's a few out there. Well, the cloud is useless. That is without mobile connectivity, right? If you can't get to it, then what is the great benefit we're talking about? So the massive growth in the number of connected devices you're all hearing about at the conference and machines are really going to strain the capabilities of the infrastructure that we have today. One of our members, Nokia, predicts, of course, tens of billions of new devices and machines are going to come online. It could be more than that. You hear outrageous numbers, but whatever it is, we know that supporting those devices is going to require a major investment from both the public sector and private sector in new infrastructure. We need a massive advance in communications technology and densification of infrastructure deployment. I think we're now on the precipice of that with 5G, which is one way that some of this is going to get carried. 5G promises near zero latency in the network throughout it, and extremely high throughput everywhere, including at the edge of the network where consumers move. But that's really 3 years out from beginning. And fortunately, a lot of the emerging IoT use cases can function on current 4G networks, but others like autonomous driving and a lot of the exciting things we're talking about here and we're seeing in the exhibit hall are going to require the kind of lack of latency and no loss of data rates even during congested periods that 5G will provide. So in short, the emergence of this connected world with access to data and applications everywhere is really a paradigm shift. And it's one that we need new thinking about infrastructure design, about infrastructure deployment and management. The people in this room have a lot of wonderful ideas about great new applications and you have big plans, but as I'm saying, your success depends on the success of the infrastructure to meet your needs. And that really rests on three big inputs for networks. One is densification networks, and I'll talk about that. Another, it's more antennas closer to end users. Another is exponential expansion of backhaul to make sure that that data can get back to the network. And three is more spectrum that can be used cleanly for IoT applications, both existing spectrum and new spectrum that's needed. So, all the wonderful ideas here in Fort Lauderdale are going to require this big development of wireless infrastructure. It means we need more cell towers and more antennas on poles, more antennas of all sizes that attach to all kinds of buildings and bus stops, street furniture. And of course, we need the all-important fiber networks to make sure that we connect all these wireless technologies. And the data transmitted from car to traffic light or from pedestrian to car doesn't work if the mobile networks aren't in place. So we need so much more wireless infrastructure. It is really the challenge, I think, of our age today. And this is something that's increasingly recognized in Washington, that this is a big transformation that we need to have. And we need to make sure that policies are in place to enable that. So it won't be easy. The bottom line is that the Internet of Things requires a network of reality. And wireless infrastructure is that network of reality. So I'm glad we begin this conference with that, because too often at IoT you talk about all these great things, but we don't talk about what really makes it possible. So I want to talk about densification of networks just a bit. In order to create this network of reality, we need to build all over these cities and in rural areas, macro rooftops, macros on towers, small cells, DAS, and Wi-Fi. This integrated infrastructure will really help carriers to meet the bandwidth needs that we're talking about here. Now, this is an example where you have, on the one hand, one tower, all these people using it, it gets congested. You add a couple cell sites, and that same spectrum can be reused, and you can have everybody happier. People that are using the traditional uses as well as IoT and others. And of course, some of these antennas will be carrier antennas. There's other networks that are being built, all kinds of antennas close to the end user. These are going to be dense 5G networks that we refer to as a heterogeneous networks, so they're HETNets. We actually have at WIA the HETNet forum where we discuss these issues. That means combining macro sites with smaller base stations and using a range of radio access technologies from LTE. We're going to be talking about Wi-Fi a lot. Any future technologies like 5G. We need to include all of these pieces of the network in order to deliver both the coverage and the capacity that's needed, not just for the Internet of Things, but these growing applications of video and what people are using day to day. And most industry experts agree that, they see an infrastructure that requires extreme densification in order to achieve the goals for downlink speeds and latency and coverage. And while it's difficult to quantify today, we certainly think that future networks will rely heavily on small cells like these in order to meet the demands. To date, of course, small cells haven't proved as cost-effective as originally forecast, and there aren't as many that have been deployed as rapidly as some had hoped because of technical, economic, and regulatory as well as administrative issues. But as a relatively new technology, we think the technical issues can be overcome, but these regulatory and administrative problems that we deal with at WIA are really persistent and may, in the long run, prove more problematic. As CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association, I talk to people every day, innovators that are working to try to deliver this wireless connectivity. It's not easy to deploy and build these networks, but we at WIA are working with our members hand in hand to overcome the obstacles that we run into every day. In fact, no one has done more to advance mobile networks than WIA. It might not, we used to be called PCIA, aka formerly known as, and we've been at it for a long time. I've been doing Marco Rubio here since I'm in Florida and have some water. I served as a commissioner of the FCC before joining WIA. When I was there, I learned, that regulators can cause a lot of problems. But if they understand the issue, they can also help bring solutions together. And WIA is the association that brings the whole ecosystem together. We bring together carriers and the infrastructure companies and the IoT companies and the entire world, that whether you know or not, we're fighting for you day in and day out. And we work with federal governments, we work with state governments, we work with local governments to make sure that you can deploy your systems as quickly and efficiently as possible. So, we have end users that are involved in trying to get solutions like CBRE or John Deere that are looking for IoT solutions and looking for in-building solutions. They all come together at an annual show that takes place right here in Florida, as a matter of fact, in Orlando in May. So we're really your voice in Washington. When you meet resistance or in the States, we have a lot of advocacy efforts we undertake on your behalf. We convinced Congress, for example, to enact a law that allows co-location by right, so that when you want to swap out an antenna on an existing tower or a small cell, you can upgrade that without having to get new zoning. And then we got the FCC to put the strongest possible rules in place so that could happen. And we advocate shot clocks to get these things done quickly, making sure applications for new infrastructure are really processed quickly and appropriately so we can get this network built. We've also secured new regulations that ensure attachments to utility infrastructure like telephone poles, like light poles, and make sure it's done quickly and using co-location by right. And we've developed a national model state bill, so we're fighting in legislatures here in Florida and across the country to make sure that we have systems in place that are regularizing rates for attachments so you don't become a revenue source for local governments. Make sure that things move quickly to make sure that it's done responsibly. We're not saying you put up anything anywhere or you're going to end up with a backlash where you don't get things built, but a responsible sort of rationalization of the system is needed in not only the federal laws, but in state governments and in local governments as well. So we've really, I think, saved companies tens of millions, if not more, of dollars to get wireless to communities around the country, and there's still a lot more to do. Creating a predictable and fair business environment, as you know, is critical. If you want to make an investment, you know, it's tough to do without knowing what the rules are, without knowing how long you're going to be held up for, without knowing how long it's going to take to get the system built to meet your customers' needs. So we have working groups, we call it the Innovation and Technology Council, of experts that are coming together from enterprise, infrastructure companies, and they're charting a way forward for us. So we get input from our members on what your problems are, what the pain points are, and then we go to work to try to solve them. We're, of course, keeping a close eye on the Trump administration plans for an infrastructure initiative. At this point, no one really knows exactly what it's going to be rolled out with, but there's a growing consensus both in the administration and in Congress on a bipartisan basis that it should include telecom infrastructure. And it should be, you know, in the package no matter what form it takes, whether it's tax credits or federal funding. We're going to fight to make sure it's something that benefits the industry. You know, we think that enabling these devices everywhere is vital to our communities. It's the only way that towns are going to be connected and smart cities is through more infrastructure to make this possible. We need ubiquitous connectivity, and the paths of complete coverage can't be obstructed with irresponsible regulations. I don't think some communities realize how high the stakes are for them when it comes to the future wireless coverage. They might see us as a revenue opportunity so they don't have to raise taxes. Let's just hit the infrastructure companies. But we can't afford to let them do that. You know, we need to make sure we turn that around by explaining the challenge, explaining that there isn't a bottomless well here of resources, and explaining the amount of demand that there is. You've probably all seen the chart that there's a wireless data crunch going on. Let me fix that. We're back. Anyway, you've seen the numbers that there are incredible demands for wireless infrastructure. Right now, you can't quite see it on this chart, it didn't come out right, but 700% increase over 5 years, 50% annual growth rates in wireless data. And a lot of that's coming from smartphones, which account for most wireless connections today, but the number of machine-to-machine connections or device-to-internet connections are growing exponentially. And it's leading to what I call a wireless data crunch. You might have heard the term spectrum crunch, and there's that, but I call it a wireless data crunch because it's broader than just spectrum. And so is the answer. There's really 3 different dials that you can turn up in order to get more bandwidth, more broadband over wireless networks. One of them is spectrum, as I discussed. Technological efficiencies is another, and third, wireless infrastructure. Let me just briefly touch on each one. Clearly, we need more spectrum, and we need to use the spectrum we have more efficiently. You've seen that FCC is just wrapping up today the auction for the broadcast spectrum, 600 megahertz spectrum, but it'll probably take another 3 to 5 years before you get any relief on current frequencies from a lot of that. By the time it gets repacked and actual devices are swapped out and the antennas are swapped out on the towers. So all this increase in demand that you're seeing is without any help from that. Another recent study showed it takes 13 years on average to get spectrum reallocated for commercial use. And yet CTIA, my other association partner, has done a study that shows we need 350 megahertz of new spectrum by 2020 to cope with rising data demands. So we're in a bit of a crunch. Remember that 700% increase in demand we talked about? Well, this auction that they just had won't even help. And yet the FCC is doing what it can to get more spectrum out there. You've heard probably about in July last year that the FCC voted to make spectrum of 24 gigahertz, the high-frequency spectrum frontiers, available for flexible use wireless services, and that'll be very helpful for next-generation wireless and making sure that you can do it. But remember, it only goes very short distances. At those frequencies, the data doesn't travel very far, doesn't go through buildings, so it's got somewhat limited applications. So we turn to technology, and of course, we're doing everything we can to speed up the throughput on these devices. You know, certainly 4G, for example, is more efficient than 3G. LTE Advanced is an advantage over that. And wireless carriers are field testing 5G today, but 5G is still years away from being in the hands of consumers. We're talking about 2020 begins to build out, but we're still building out 4G. So 5G is not going to all show up overnight. It's going to start in the most dense areas, and takes a lot of time and money, as it did to get from 4G to 4G from 3G, it will to 5G. And despite as aggressive as the FCC is being and industry is being, we really need to act now if we're not going to get crushed by the demand and make sure we can meet the needs of everybody, including IoT. We can't afford to wait for spectrum auctions or 5G. Technological innovation won't enable the wireless industry to meet the growing consumer demand or the growing demand for IoT, even when combined with the small amount of spectrum that's coming online. So I turn to infrastructure. Wireless infrastructure immediately addresses the data crunch as soon as it's built. And we know all too well that more infrastructure takes time. But when you look at the sort of rollout and what's going to deal with that 700% in the next 5 years, it seems like the most immediate solution is densification. And that's what the carriers and others are undertaking in this room that are building new networks for IoT. But you know you're in trouble when the quick solution is infrastructure rollout. That's kind of where we are today. Even when there is more spectrum or there's more technology, you still have to swap out the infrastructure to enable more bandwidth to actually get through. And there's a lot at stake. So today's wireless infrastructure provides a foundation, but we're going to need a lot more in the years ahead. So I think we need to turn this dial up all the way to 11. You might have noticed it actually goes up to 11 there in a Spinal Tap bid. Now, we work with government day in and day out to try to help you, as I mentioned. You know, my job is to make sure the wireless industry's represented at all levels of government and that you can get your job done. So we're fighting to make sure folks in Washington and folks in state capitals are getting out of your way or helping you when they need to encourage investment in infrastructure. And that will be something that will enable you to get your work done to serve your customers. I personally testified before Congress, asked them to adopt policies that streamline and accelerate broadband deployment. When I was up there, my message was simple, that wireless infrastructure makes wireless work. And I think the message got through because the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee was testifying, held up a smartphone and said, without infrastructure, this device is just an expensive paperweight, which is really what it comes down to. There's a lot of discussion last year at the FCC and in Congress about infrastructure. And there was a lot of work on 5G. In August, the FCC amended its co-location rules to streamline historic preservation review for small wireless facilities. And the FCC, I think, is really poised to do great work under its new chairman. They just installed a new chairman, Ajit Pai, who talks about the need for more wireless infrastructure and connectivity relentlessly. And he really understands the role it plays, and he's prepared to eliminate restrictive net neutrality rules that stymie new revenue streams and innovation. And just last month, he announced the creation of a broadband deployment advisory committee that will provide advice and recommendations to the commission on how to accelerate wireless broadband. And you might have heard of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That's the White House's chief arm. It's through the Department of Commerce. And they have initiated a proceeding to explore basically the role of government in fostering the advancement of IoT. It teed up broadband infrastructure issues actually in this proceeding, and it is something we talked about a lot as WI submitted its filing there. A lot of the challenges and possible solutions that we raised made it into NTIA's green paper that you can see on ntia.gov. It's also helping communities not get left behind through its Connected Communities initiative that cities are working with NTIA on their broadband plans and how to reduce barriers to deployment. So both Congress and the FCC are now working to provide our industry with the certainty that we need. They're trying to find roadblocks. They're asking us how they can help. It's a kind of relief when government comes to you and says, what do you need? You know, what can we do to make your job easier? I think that will lead to more investment. They want to see investment in broadband. They understand that it's not just another industry, that our industry promotes the entire economy. I was talking to a congressman the other day who said that the number one issue when it comes to infrastructure in her district is broadband. You know, they say, how do I get more broadband? In the rural areas, it's a huge issue, and Congress is going to respond. I think that if network builders are going to put up billions of dollars in capital, they need predictability and consistency. And believe it or not, I think policymakers are really beginning to get that. And on the local front, of course, is where the rubber meets the road on a lot of this, and we run into a lot of resistance. We need to, I think, respect and work with communities to address their concerns, but we need to push back when they go beyond reason, which happens all too often. We've worked in a lot of states to update pole attachment regulations to make sure our members have access to utility poles at fair rates, terms, and conditions. I think streamlined pole attachments spur widespread deployment of broadband, and they're the critical street furniture that we need going forward. So these kind of rules are key to the deployment of both fiber and small cells that will supplement the macro network and make sure that tomorrow's 5G networks can support smart cities and can support IoT. 5G testing, as you know, is underway now. It's something that we're going to continue to prepare for, getting ready for 2020. And what we need to do, of course, especially for 5G, is densify the networks. And I mentioned that. Essentially, for network densification, we know that we need to bring antennas closer and closer to the end user. And that allows us to basically reuse the spectrum that we have today, and not because we're not getting a lot more in anytime soon. So if you have 3 cell sites, for example, there, and you have a tower in each one, then you put more cell sites in, you reuse that same spectrum over and over again, and it really counters the demands that are being placed on the individual tower that might be in the center of it. So eventually we can get that done. You know, as we work together, I think that we can get that densification done, but what happens is when a fiber company comes in, wants to put fiber in, it's pretty easy to get the job done. But when an antenna is placed somewhere, all of a sudden communities freak out. They say, what is this? I don't know if it's fear of RF. That's a big part of it, which they actually aren't supposed to be taken into account because the FCC sets limits on those things. But we have got to make sure that antennas are respected for what they deliver and not something to be feared as we densify these networks. We have to be smart from, you know, small cells and towers and DAS inside of buildings. We're trying to remove regulatory obstacles. We're going to meet that wireless data crunch head on. We need to turn those dials to 11 so this industry can do everything that you are promising in that exhibit hall and throughout this conference to get done. We have to work hard and smart to make sure that wireless infrastructure keeps up with all these great applications and the ever-growing demand for wireless data that folks in this room are providing. And, you know, so again, I invite you all to come. We're having our show coming up in May 22nd, 25th in Orlando, right up the street here, bringing together the whole ecosystem to the degree that you're interested in how infrastructure interfaces with IoT. We're going to have a lot of discussion about that there. So I hope to see you all again there. And I certainly very much appreciate opening this conference with the critical issue of the future of wireless infrastructure in the United States. So thanks for having me. Do I have time for a question or two? Yes.
You mentioned heterogeneous networks. Can you expand a little bit about that? You have the HETNET forum and how that works.
Yeah, the question was about the HETNET and how that works. I mean, basically, we developed what we called the DAS forum in the early days of distributed antenna systems when, in 2006, we were trying to get in-building coverage through distributed antenna systems. And as things evolved with small cells and now more and more distributed networks, we changed that to the HETNET forum where we discuss how are we going to get this built. So you're talking about how the macro networks fit with the small cells, fit with DAS, fit with new networks that are being built for IoT and M2M. So all of them need to work seamlessly. I mean, for the end user, they don't really care what that infrastructure looks like. They only care about whether they get their needs met and what they receive in terms of value from IoT has to be seamless. So to make it easy for them, we have a challenge. And so we bring together experts through the HETNET forum to talk about how the HETNET is going to come together seamlessly, how we're going to blend all of these different technologies, how that interfaces with government in terms of which frequencies are being used for 5G, for IoT. So we work with the FCC, which has jurisdiction over the spectrum, and with NTIA over federal spectrum, trying to get more spectrum into the system so that you all can get your job done.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Hi, right in the middle here. Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering, given your position in the industry and, in public service, there's been a lot of discussion about net neutrality, from people that are pro-net neutrality to people that want to see it torn apart and changed now in the new administration. From the perspective that you have overseeing all of this for years now, could you talk a little bit about the pros and cons from each side, and then maybe what your position is and why?
Yeah, I was there when the FCC first addressed the issue back in 2004. We did an internet policy statement saying the internet should remain open, basically. Very vague, but a positive statement. And I think that, when the Democrats came in, they wanted to basically codify that in ways that got very into the weeds of the network, what they call Title II regulation, which treats broadband like a common carrier. Might have some advantage in terms of their ability to regulate it, but it raised the specter of rate regulation, even though we were assured there wasn't going to be rate regulation. So to some extent, it limited investment and scared off capital. I mean, my concern is that basically it's really expensive to build these networks. And if you look at where the value is being created in the Googles and the Facebooks and some of those companies that are earning far higher profit margins than the companies that are providing the connectivity, if those are just dumb pipes, then the value will continue to go out toward the edge and get aggregated there, and there won't be enough capital to build the network. So there's got to be some way that those who are investing $35 billion a year can recover enough of that in order to continue to make those levels of investments, because those levels of investments are the highest of any industry in the country. That's what basically the carriers invest every year in their mobile networks. And meanwhile, you get virtually no investment from the Facebooks of the world in the actual delivery of broadband, either over wireless or wireline. There's nascent efforts that are going on, but they're minuscule compared to what's actually needed to maintain these networks. So I think that when you look at the new chairman, he's not going to just do away with net neutrality and say that there's no need for open internet, but he will hopefully remove some of the restrictions on the ability of companies to innovate and do for example, zero rating, so you can get free music over T-Mobile. But that's an advantage for people to move to T-Mobile, but the previous administration raised questions about some of these zero rating plans, and then it makes it more difficult for them to compete and innovate and provide services. So in the end, I think we're going to see it scaled back dramatically, taken out of Title II, which is a good thing for investment in the networks. And we're going to see something, it's like repeal and replace kind of thing. It's not going to be just repeal and leave a complete wide open space. So I think there's going to be quite a debate over the next year about how far that replacement goes. I think it'll go back to what we did back when I was on the FCC, when the Republicans were last in charge, which is say that there's basic rules of the road, that the internet has to remain open, but not specifying or having the overhang of rate regulation and limiting innovative approaches and completely eliminating the ability of carriers to basically find a way to monetize some of the value that they're creating by investing in these networks. With that, I think I probably have to go because I know I'm running a little behind. So thank you all very much for having me. Good to see you.